Hello, everyone, and welcome to another K6 Office Hours. I'm Nicole van der Hoeven.
Hello, my name's
Marie,
Marie.
would you like
Yeah, I'm
like a
Marie.
And
well-oiled machine?
yes, and I'm Pavel.
So, Powell, you are the CTO of K6. So, thank you for coming to join us today. I think we're talking about a topic that you have opinions on, so that's why we invited you here. I guess
Excellent.
let's kick it off by talking about what behavior driven development even is. And I'm going to be asking a lot of questions because I think Marie is way more knowledgeable at this than I am. So Marie, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, BDD or behavior driven development. So it's a way of working that's been introduced. So this was first coined by a person named Dan North. So essentially, he introduced BDD as a way to bridge the gap between the business and the technical people, because most often when we're developing, when we're testing software, we end up with requirements that are often confusing. And so what happens, most of the time is we're delivering a feature or a software that the business didn't really need, or they wanted something else, but then it was interpreted in a way that was totally different. And BDD was introduced to basically, fix those communication issues. So it's forcing the business and the development team to basically talk to each other, come up with high level examples using plain language, so that everyone has this shared understanding of what a feature should do. So to me, that is um, the essence basically of what the behavior driven development is.
Wow, Powell, did you hear she even knows who came up with it?
Yeah, yeah, I'm super impressed. So I think I will be learning about BDD on this session. So I
Yeah.
I I integrated this library into K6, but I think not because I wanted to reach the goals of BDD. I had other reasons to do it. So we'll see if Marie's purpose for BDD is the same as mine purpose for this library.
And also, as you might have guessed already, we don't all consider ourselves experts on this topic. So if you feel the same way, drop a question and we'll try to get it answered. The more general, the better. We It might be difficult to answer like very specific things that we need to troubleshoot with you on, but if you have like general, hey, what does this mean, or how does this work kind of questions, we'll try to answer them live, or at least, Marie and Powell will. So, Marie, as I'm listening to you talk, I can't help but think, like, isn't this just always the way that we should test and develop things? I mean, shouldn't we always have the end user in mind?
I think that is the ultimate goal, but you'll be surprised with that there are still teams out there that aren't really communicating. Because to me, it's like the problems that we have, especially in our projects, it's more of a communication issue rather than a technical or like something else. So it always boils down to not really communicating what you really mean, or communicating something else, but then it was misunderstood in a way that wasn't really intended. So I think the ultimate goal really is to create something that our users want, but then somewhere along the way, from requirements, development, testing, there's always some areas where the requirements could be misunderstood, because we all have different perspectives. So if we try to make the examples clear as possible in a language that everyone has that same understanding, then we can lessen the risks. We can deliver something that our users really want. But yeah, that's always been the ultimate goal.
Yeah. So I think we should also talk about a very related methodology or philosophy, I guess, which is test-driven development. Powell,
Yeah.
as a developer, is that something that you've come across or implemented before?
Sure. So TDD, I feel like it's related, but I feel that's quite a different concept where tests are written before the actual code that implements the test, right? So you first write the test, you make it fail because the functionality is not there, and then you implement functionality to make sure that the test succeeds later on. Um, that's definitely something that has been known in the industry for a long time. Uh, Personally, I don't think it's very widely used. It's definitely very widely talked about,
Yeah.
but I have not seen it used successfully, at least in a larger scope. It's been used successfully in smaller projects that I've seen, but in nothing large. But that's my personal experience. So others may have different one.
Yeah, I think I agree with Pablo because it's one of those topics that are widely talked about. But from projects that I've been part of, we do have some developers advocating for TDD, but not everyone adopts it. So I remember on like my previous role, we had like a session where one of our principal developers explain how to do TDD. So I think it's one of those things that some developers really do on a day-to-day basis while they're coding, but it's not something I guess that everyone does. I think everyone wants to do it, but I don't know because I'm not like a developer per se. So I think it's quite difficult to get started because you're writing the test rather than the actual functionality first, whereas I think we are more used to the other way around. But I definitely see the benefits because if you write the test first, you're not wasting, I guess, code because you're just writing code that really gives value. So I
Right.
definitely see the point to it.
Yeah, I agree that it seems like it's really good process, but from my experience, I think most projects that we run in K6 in engineering teams are not simple projects that are well defined. So it is in practice very often projects are exploratory first. The developer needs to discover what exactly needs to be implemented and how to do it and compare different ways of doing it. So very often we do like prototyping and we code something first to see how this should be implemented, then throw away that code and then actually code it for real. Um, so I think it would be incredibly difficult to first write tests when we don't know exactly what the software should be. Um,
Mhm.
but for smaller projects where the API is well known and well specified, then definitely TDD could work.
So, Powell, I hope you don't have anything super top secret on your whiteboard because we've got a pixel peeper here, Paul, who's already trying to read it.
Concealer, yeah. No, I have. So this, I'm at home, and this is my whiteboard where I doodle all kinds of nonsense. So don't read into it too much.
Okay, well, so correct me if I'm wrong, Marie. I'd like to try to test what how I understand it too. But it kind of sounds like from talking to you both that test driven development is more on the development side and BDD kind of happens before that. Because when you're developing it, then you should have already gotten some sort of requirement. It kind of sounds like BDD is like earlier on in the cycle. Is do you think or in the project? Is that right? Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. So when we think of BDD, it's more of a whole team approach as well, because you get like people from different perspectives. So you've got someone from the business, someone from the development, someone from the testing. They basically talk to each other and then expand a specific requirement. A most commonly used technique is example mapping, where you basically try to map different examples to a specific feature. So I think BDD definitely can be started before TDD because it's a way of I guess trying to expand more on the requirements, giving examples before actually coding something. So you get to find out, I guess, a lot of hidden assumptions that people might have, hidden risks that we should uncover as earlier as possible. So yep, I think BDD should come before TDD.
Okay. And also, it seems like a lot of BDD is about kind of using a language. Like I said earlier, the philosophy, it seems to me, is really nothing new. This is how we should be testing or developing things, developing software. But it seems like BDD provides a language or like a structure that makes it easier to think in this way, and so we don't have to think all the time about how we phrase something. And I think one of the main differences is that when I started testing, I always thought of it in terms of like test cases, and then somewhere along the way, it became there was a shift towards user stories, and then now it's like in BDD, it's specifications or sometimes
Mhm.
examples. Is this all the same thing and different names for it, or are there actual significant differences?
Yeah, I think so. When we say of example mapping, for example, the output of that are different examples using plain language that everybody should have, like, I guess, the same understanding. So a very common language that people use is gherkin. So this is using the keywords given, when, and then. So you sort of define, given there is like a precondition, and then when is more of like the action, and then is the outcome that you expect. So I guess by utilizing those keywords, you are explaining an example clearly. There's no room for like any misunderstanding. And a very common sort of like difference as well is, I guess, if we think about a test case, it's more of like a very detailed like step explaining on, oh, this is, for example, is it's more tied into like the implementation. Whereas if we think about like features or like specifications, it's more tied into the behavior. And I guess that's what BDD is trying to sort of fixes, rather than tying it to a specific implementation. It's more of like, what is the behavior that our user is actually trying to perform in this particular user journey. So if I think of like previous test cases that I've written, it's like very like tied into the implementation, where I've got step by step on, oh, you have to click this button, you have to type this username. Whereas what if the implementation change, but the behavior is still gonna be the same? So it's all about, for example, if we think of like a login feature, we can think of examples like, if we provide a valid username but an invalid password, then we should display this particular error message. Whereas on the test case side, it's more of, click this button, type this in the field,
Mhm.
and what if the implementation changed, then the test case will need to be, I guess, updated. So to me, the behavior driven development is more on like the behavior like examples.
Okay, so it's a higher level of abstraction from a test case, but a lower one from a requirement, or is it the same as a requirement?
Because I guess a requirement can be expanded into different like scenarios, isn't it? So we could have a requirement that says user should be able to log in, but then if we use like different examples to it, especially when we talk about this during like the Amigo session, some companies they call this like story shaping, but the main idea is you've got someone from the business, someone from development, someone from testing. They come up with all the different examples, they look at a specific requirement, and they think of different possible ways that the user would use that particular requirement. So um it's not necessarily similar to a requirement because it's more of like an extension to requirements.
So, Powell, you mentioned that you weren't really thinking of BDD when you created Chai.js. Well, I guess let's take a step back. What is Chai.js? What are we talking about here?
Right, right. Yeah, so two good questions. So Chai.js is a JavaScript testing framework that is well known in the industry, and many JavaScript developers are using it for testing JavaScript applications. So this is a relatively well-established library with good amount of functionality. And this is something that users couldn't really use in K6 before. So the work has been done to integrate Chai.js into K6. So this framework can be used and for various different reasons, and none of them are what Marie listed. So that's interesting. All of the goals of BTD, I think, although they sound very good, they were not the reason why I decided to integrate it. So now to your other question, why did we do it? So there were several reasons, and I don't know what exactly was the reason back then that pushed me to do it. But the first reason is that I really did not like the check syntax that we have in K6. It was not intuitive to me. So very often where I wanted to write a check, I myself, that I use K6 every day, I had to go to documentation to remember what's the syntax for a check.
I thought that was just me.
No, me too.
Okay.
And also, Paula, like the thing that I was most confused by with regard to the check when I first started using K6 was that I expected that if the check doesn't pass, like if you're checking for something for an HTTP 200 and you get a 404 or something, that then that failure would be recorded somewhere, like maybe I don't know, that the test would fail or something because of it. And it was that expectation, I guess. I was already jumping to assertions rather than checks. But we have a question before we get into those differences. We have a question from Manjit Khalsa, who says, are we saying we can integrate Cucumber.js to K6?
Probably. We haven't done it, so that's probably possible. But it's a work that hasn't been done, at least by us here in K6.
Yeah, and I think as well, before we sort of ask why we want to integrate it, I think we need to check first if like what do actually people mean. So do they want like a way of having that sort of given when then keyword when they write a performance test, so the team can basically understand what's happening with the entire performance test? Because if that's the main sort of objective, I think that would be awesome in the future. Because I think having a tool where it's written in plain language definitely removes any like ambiguity, and that can also serve as a as an additional documentation. But from experience as well, while there are benefits, they do add an extra layer of complexity, because then we would have to map, like, let's say, the different feature files to like the different functions. So yep, I think having it integrated would be awesome, because I don't think I've ever used BDD way of writing when it comes to performance tests.
We got a +1 to Cucumber.js integration from DLOKL.
Yeah,
This is the
we
time
welcome.
to suggest it. Well, we have the CTO here.
Well, we welcome contributions and we accept pull requests.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. Okay, so what is the difference then between cucumber and chai, and mocha is pretty popular too, gherkin? Are these all the same thing, or are they trying to do the same thing, the same different solutions for the same problem?
So Gherkin is like the actual language that, for example, people use when we write the scenario. So it's using the given when then syntax. Cucumber is a tool that basically helps, write these feature files. So when we say of a feature file, it's a collection of different scenarios, and Cucumber is the main tool for writing these feature files, so they can then be serve as your basis for your automated tests. Other frameworks like Mocha, so there's also Jest, from JavaScript. So Jest and Mocha are two of the like really popular test runners, and I think it's more on the test runner perspective, where it's quite similar to what Pavel has done with Chai.js, where we have the describe keyword so that we can better describe a specific test. So I think if we link that back to K6 world, that was the purpose of group, right? Like we have different groups, and then you can provide like different like messages so that it's more descriptive. So I think now with K6 Chai.js, we use the keyword describe to describe a specific test. So I think with the other sort of test frameworks, it depends, because I think Jest, it's like fully built in with like the different assertions. K6 Chai.js, I guess it's more on the assertion side as well, where we can leverage the existing Chai syntax. So I think some of these tools are built in with basically all of the other things that we also need. But some tools, so for example with Cucumber, you have to also integrate that with like other testing runners. And I guess with K6 Chai.js, we can do the description, so by using the describe block, and then the assertions as well. But it's not but we are still using the K6 runner. So it's not a full blown test runner, basically.
So, does either of you have any ideas on what is the difference between a check, an assertion, and a threshold?
Sure. Let me take that, but before we do, I just wanted to say that the goals that we have listed for BDD are very good, but those were not the reasons that we integrated it in K6. So one reason that we didn't like check was the first one. The other one was that some users wanted to do lots of functional testing in K6, and check is just such a low-level API that it's not very convenient to do functional testing with check. And Chai.js allows that much easier, like assertions. And if you have a test where you want to create 100 checks, it's inconvenient, while with expect it's much easier to do. The other reason was that the check API is a native K6 API that is not familiar to anyone except for the engineers at K6, right? So it's not something that we have copied from another standard library, it's something that we invented. So providing more familiar APIs for engineers that are doing testing is important, I felt. Yeah, and the last point is that it was much easier to create automatic messages when something fails. When you create a check, you have to provide your own message in full, while with assertion that gets, or the expect keyword in Chai, the message gets automatically generated. So it's also up to date. So you can change the check logic, but forget to change the check message, and you have a little bit of discrepancy, while this is not possible with Chai. And the last point was error handling. So the check syntax doesn't really do a great job at error handling when there are multiple checks in a batch. Something can fail, and it's handled could be better. So we've done it better with chai. Maybe we can demonstrate that a little bit later.
Yeah. I think though with because you mentioned that it's much more, I guess, easier to understand, so we could also link that back to behavior driven development, because if we, I guess, look at the syntax of writing tests using chai, they use like plain keywords like expect or should. So it's again like in plain English. So if someone is looking at the different assertions, they would be, I guess, better equipped to understand it much more. Whereas if we're just using the checks, it could be, I guess, less like readable, and like some people might also find that difficult to understand.
Yeah, that's correct. And also I think it's easier to write shorter tests in using this new framework rather than the native check.
Well, maybe let's circle back around to the thresholds versus checks versus assertions. Let's jump into what it actually looks like and then try to derive from that what the differences are. I will say that our colleague Ben wrote an excellent blog post on K6 Chai JS. I've posted the link in the comments here, but if you'd like to follow along, then maybe have that open while you're listening to us. But maybe Marie, you could show us what we're talking about and what it looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I don't know if this is big enough. Hopefully, that's all good.
That's better.
So okay, so I guess we could start first with like dummy examples and not like have it integrated yet to K6. So if you're already familiar, with Chai, so all these different examples, it was actually taken from the Chai JS website. So they have all the different examples. So you can see here that it just works great with K6. If you want to use should, you can also do your assertion using the should syntax. But as you can see here, it's already much easier to understand. We can use describe to explain our test much better. So this is already creating that sense of familiarity, because if you're coming from like a mocha or just background, describe is a standard way of describing a specific test. And then for the different
Hey,
assertion,
Marie,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to clarify first. If people want to get started with this
Mhm.
isn't an extension, right? You just have to import the library,
Ah,
which Marie is
yeah.
doing in online one.
Line one, yeah. So all you need to do is just import it from this JSlib, and you just need to include the K6 Chai.js index.js file. I believe the latest version is this one, and you just import, the different things that you need. So for this specific example, because I needed describe, expect, and for me to actually use chai.should, I had to import the chai command as well. But nope, I didn't install any extra package. I didn't build a custom binary with xk6. It's just all imported directly.
Cool.
Cool. Yeah, so as you can see, I've added I've commented this. So maybe what would be good is if I can demo it, because I think if we have like a failing check, like what Pavel said, when we just use check, it will still execute the other checks that you have. Whereas let's say if I comment this out, so you can see here that this is actually a failing assertion. So if I save that, and if I just run that particular test, so you can see that for this first describe block, I only have two assertions that were run, and the rest weren't run because the second assertion was failing. Whereas if we compare that with checks, if you have additional check after a failing check, those will still be executed. So you can see here that it will actually halt the execution for the rest of your checks.
Yeah, and this is super important, and I think one of the primary reasons why we have this library, because you can imagine in your load test, if you're using K6 for load testing, and you have a user flow where, for example, you create an account first, then authenticate, then do some action. What often happens is that users write a test like this with assumption that everything will work.
Yeah.
Right, so they assume that the user creation will work, and therefore it's possible to authenticate and possible to do some action. But if we get like 500 HTTP 500 on the first step and continue, those other results don't really make sense and should not be executed. So with Chai, it's possible to fail on this first step and skip the other steps.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess now it would
Is
be
that the
good.
default behavior?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicole.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Is that the default behavior in Chai?
It's default behavior in K6 with Chai, but I believe in Chai as
Okay.
well, that they skip the other expect statements if the first one failed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's correct. So if you have any other assertions in Chai, and if the previous one fails, it will basically it won't execute the rest of the assertions that you have added in.
So I'm already seeing what Powell was mentioning earlier, that there are a lot of automatic messages, because I don't see anywhere here that you said like expected 42 but got 44 or whatever. And yet it still said that. And I find that really useful because it's like actually human readable and I know exactly what happened and where it failed.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a plus. Because if you have, I guess, a test that has a lot of checks, it would be easier to debug. Let's say, for example, this one was failing. Like you could like instantly see, why this was an error. Whereas I guess with check, if you only have like, because you can add like a description, right? But then if it fails, I think this will just say that, yeah, there's one test that's failing, but you don't actually know why it's failing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but
The exact values are not interpolated into the message in check, but here they are.
Yeah.
okay, that's super useful. But in these metrics, it just has checks. It doesn't have like assertions or anything. But I guess that's something that you could change with like the handle summary.
This one.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's an ambition for the next iteration of this library, to create a new handle summary, a default one, that would display those results a little nicer.
Mm. That would be awesome.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. Should we go with the other demo where it's more integrated with K6?
Sure, but I'm curious about that K6 check JS. Is that are those two the same thing, but one's with chai and one's with check?
Yeah,
You're so
exactly.
prepared, Marie. I'm so glad.
So this K6 Chai JS, so this was actually taken from the blog post that Ben wrote. So I just created a file for all the different examples, and I thought that it would be a great opportunity to show in today's office hours, like what it actually looks if you just use an existing check. So maybe I can talk about like the different scenarios first. So if we look at, let's say, this first particular describe block, it's just fetching a list of public crocodiles. So you can see here that, yeah, we're just using the http.get. And then once we have the response, we're just writing multiple expect statements. So first, I'm just saying that the response status, we're expecting that to equal to a 1. We're also expecting the response to be a valid JSON body, and we're also expecting the length to be a certain number. But what I want to show, so before I run this test, is to check what is to show you how that looks like if you're just using K6 check. So let me just close the rest. So here, I've also used group rather than describe, just to show that if we're not using the describe block, then you can use the group um, keyword to basically have like a better name as well for your tests. So you could see that it's quite similar to the one that we have in K6 try. But then rather than assertion, so I have a check here. So I actually have a multiple check. One is just checking the response status, and one is checking the response.body. So I guess with this, like you could like already see that the syntax, it's a bit different from what you're used to if you're using expect. So instantly you could see like the difference already. But what I want to do now, because if you notice here, my first expect, actually it's incorrect, because this should be equivalent to 200. So let's see how that will run if I run that particular file. K6 chai. So you can see here that the rest of the different assertions didn't execute. So it failed, on the first assertion. Whereas if I run the other one using check, oh, sorry, I forgot to change the status here just to show a failing test. So you can see here that even though this test, this assertion or this check, fails, the next check is still executed. So this is, I guess, one of the difference already if you're using checks. So if you have if you have failing checks, it won't really stop the execution of your tests. And I guess for the rest of the test, so this is just showing like different examples. So you can do um, like compare two different objects. You could also compare specific key, like value pairs from like the body itself. So if you don't want to, I guess, compare, the actual JSON body, you can also just compare like the different keys. So that's also like much easier to do if you're using um, um, Chai.js. And if I look at K6 check, oh yeah, I was doing some console log statements here. But yeah, you can see here that yeah, I'm also using the check keywords. And yeah, I guess the different assertions here are also quite similar to the previous example. So I'm just checking the response status, and I'm checking the like error messages. But one thing that stands out as well, let me just go back. Oh, this one. So while the examples for the Chai.js, so you could see that the messages are much more easier, to understand, whereas the examples that we have for the checks, it's basically whatever you have specified as part of this like description. And if it fails, so, for example, here, like you're left wondering, oh, why did my response status fail? Because there's not a lot of description when we run, a test with a check in K6. So, to me, that's like a really plus, because if we look back at the Try JS1, you could see here exactly why it failed. So it's expecting the status code 200 to be equivalent to 201.
I think that's really useful because it gives information as to how severe that error or that failure is, right? Because to me, I would react differently if I saw expected 200 but got 404 or 500 versus 200 versus 201. I mean, it's not on the same level of severity for me. But there's a question here that maybe Powell can answer. DLOKL says, what is the performance difference or any measurement using the K6 native check versus the K6 chai check?
It's a great question. And this was also a concern for me if when we integrate chai into K6, are we going to lose a lot of performance? So I do not have a straightforward answer to this. It's definitely requiring more CPU to execute chai than native K6. And the large scale tests that I've run worked. So it's not obviously very bad that you can only run it with 100 views or something like this. I've run it with several thousands of views, but I do not have the answer specifically how much CPU extra we need to execute that. It's not as bad as some other libraries that I tried to integrate. I think I tried with Jest, and that was not a success. So chai was relatively lightweight.
I think it's also hard for us to say for sure, like, oh yeah, it's always 1.27 times slower than than just the native one, because it really is so dependent on how many checks are you using and what kind of application is this, and are you parsing huge response bodies, and there's a lot of factors that you have to take into consideration, to the point that I think maybe it might be more meaningful to say you should always just measure the utilization, CPU and memory for that matter, of your load generator, and always monitor that to see if it's going up, if it's going too high for too long of the test. I think that's like maybe a safer answer. But another question. Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that it is a trade-off between the performance and the convenience, right? So you have to decide what is more important to you. And I think for most users that are using K6 for load testing, in general, this is not going to be trade-off because they have extra resources to run tests. So I don't think most users are maxing out the CPU on the server or machine when they run K6. So for most users, this would be a better choice. But for some percentage of users that really want to squeeze out as many requests per second from K6 as possible, they have to consider what is more important.
Yeah. I think it's more than convenience too. Go ahead, Marie.
Because I guess as well, so if I tie this back to XK6 browser, where it's more browser based and functional, like I was saying a while ago that my instinct already was to use try.js because I know that it would be easier for me to write the assertions, whereas if I use the traditional check that's native in K6, it might be much more complex and trivial, that I will always have to look at the API documentation, whereas when I was using try.js, it was just so easy for me to assert like the content, assert that the element is there. So it depends as well. So if you're I guess like depending on what your use case is, because if it's more from a functional or browser testing perspective, then you might want to make a case that using try.js would actually work better.
Yeah, that's a great plug for the browser, and I've also have written a bunch of examples for the browser, and I use it quite a lot. So yeah, K6 is very composable.
We have a question from Gino Paolo Telenta. Hi, K6 team. Is it possible to check the response time with Chai? Or is it mandatory to use thresholds for this? I love this because this whole time I'm thinking, what part of this can be applied or should be applied to performance testing?
So I think so. I should say that I started this project with functional testing in mind. So I wanted K6 to be very good for functional testing, and in my mind, Chai was the way to achieve that. But then I realized that the syntax of Chai is suitable for all kinds of testing, and now I use it for load testing as well. It's not only for functional testing. What was the question? Thresholds.
Response time.
Response time. So response time can be measured with Chai or without Chai, with thresholds or without thresholds, depending on what is expected. So if you would like to measure specific response time of a single request, that's still accessible through response.timings. I think response time. So you will get a specific response time for one request. But that's not very meaningful for most load testing, right? So you would want to aggregate all of the response times into one and use percentiles, and that's what thresholds are for. So Chai definitely doesn't replace thresholds. Thresholds are still necessary.
It's so interesting that Marie, as soon as she joined, went right to Chai.js, but I haven't used it yet. What I did miss when I first joined is I was still thinking in terms of the performance world. So like, what is a transaction? And I was asking people like, so how do you make a transaction in K6? And universally, I got, what is a transaction? Because I didn't realize that that was a performance test specific term. And it is kind of like what the describe block is for you, Marie. But a transaction to me is not just one thing. It could be like a user flow. It could be several things, like several requests that maybe all pertain to a single action. And a transaction has, I was expecting like transaction level response times and think time and like things that you do on a transaction level, not a request level. So I think it's interesting that it's almost like K6 just has like requests or a certain checks and stuff, but then you can add this layer and hey, it's a functional testing tool. Maybe you can add another layer and hey, it's what you would expect from a performance testing tool. Is there such a thing as using Chai.js for chaos?
Certainly. So K6 is not really a load testing tool. It's a reliability testing platform, as I say internally here in the company. So of course, it's very good for load testing, but it's also very good for other use cases that people have not yet discovered. So this check or this expect and describe syntax from Chai definitely applies to all of the other types of tests that we plan to develop and are developing right now. It's very composable, so K6 can do many different things, and a JavaScript library integrates with many other types of tests that we have.
So maybe with Gina's question, we should also return to the question of what is the difference between a check, an assertion, and a threshold?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I guess
I can say what I think, and then you two can like disagree or something. That's how opinions are formed, right? So I kind of think that the check is the most, I would say basic, but that sounds like it's simple or it's the most low level, I guess, of the three. I think they're all test criteria, all three of them are, but they're at different levels. The way I think of a check is that it's something that verifies the execution of the test script, which technically the other two do as well, but it's at the lowest level. So like as an example, the response returned should include login in the body. That would be an example of a check. But then I feel like an assertion is one step beyond that, where it's saying, okay, well, if you don't find login, then fail this check or assertion, and fail the rest of the test potentially, or at least not continue forward. And I think a threshold is even higher than either of them, because it's not on the level of the individual request or action. It's more like, hey, if there's an error rate that is above 1% or 5% or whatever it is, then fail this threshold. So it's like, it's not based on one thing, it's based on the entire test, because you're talking about percentages. Would you too disagree with that?
So when I think about those concepts, let's start the other side about thresholds. So thresholds for me are like pass-fail criteria for the entire test. So it's not for specific thing that happened in the test. It's for the summary of the data at the end of the test. So with thresholds, you can evaluate if the test is successful or not, right? So that's the higher level criteria, I would say. So check is a low level criteria that may, depending on your expectations, may mean that the test is failed or not. But very often in load testing, you accept certain level of errors, and you can still claim that the test is successful. For example, if you have 1% of errors in your test, this could be acceptable, and this could be a successful test. So you cannot say if the test is successful or failed based on a single check, right? And assertion is a keyword that we don't use in K6 because it's associated with more immediacy, that if assertion fails, then entire thing fails. So that's why we haven't used this keyword assertion. Instead, we use check.
But with the K6 chai JS, so all those different like expect, because I call them expect assertions because I'm used from a like browser automation perspective, that we have different assertions. So from a K6 perspective, do we still call them a check?
Yeah, so under the hood, they are implemented using a check. So we are calling the actual K6 check under the hood when someone writes expect. So that's how it's implemented in K6.
That kind of makes sense to me, because for me, an assertion is a check plus. It's like a check with a little bit more of a wrapper around it to say, oh, hey, also if it fails, then fail the whole thing, and also if it fails, have this nice error message. So it's really like an upgraded version of a check.
That's right.
Okay, so when Gino says, is it mandatory to use thresholds for this? The answer is no. It is mandatory to use checks, whether that's the K6 native check or the chai assertion/check. Either way, you're going to be able to verify the response time. It just depends on what kind of behavior, how you want that to be handled by your script. Do you want it to fail the rest of the test, or have a nice error message, or is it really just like a check in a very shallow level, like, hey, I just wanted to check, but if it's not that, then it's okay, just want to know, more like a warning rather than like an error. And either way, whether you use the K6 check or the chai check, K6 chai check, you can use thresholds for both of them, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so where is this going? Is this particular implementation, chai.js and BDD in general, do you see that as something that can be applied to, like, across all testing disciplines, meaning, chaos and performance and load and reliability? Or is this a very functional specific thing? I know you said it was for functional, but like a lot of things in K6, it can be used in a lot of different cases.
Yeah, I intended it for functional testing, but really I realized that it is not for functional testing only. So yeah, right now when I write load tests, I only use this type of syntax. I don't use check from K6. And when I write a browser test, I also use expect. So I think it will be used throughout the platform, but of course it's not required. So if someone doesn't like it, it's not something that they have to use.
So if it's, why shouldn't it be, well, okay, not required, but should it be baked into K6 core? Is that something that you've thought about?
It takes only one line to import it. So I don't think we need to bake it in. And being able to import it also makes it easier for us to iterate on the library and release more versions. So you can use the old K6 version with a new Chai version, right? So we try not to bake in functionality that is not core functionality.
Another great question here. Say the organization already has functional testing written in JavaScript, Chai.js, Cucumber.js, BDD, etc. Is there a way to join the efforts by writing K6 from the existing functional testing work? So basically, what work do they need to do to convert all of those existing test suites, BDD test suites, and put it into K6?
So I don't know about this specific implementation, but if you go to the Chai.js official documentation, not the K6 one, but the official one, and you copy examples, they are totally runnable in K6. So you don't have to make any modifications to run existing Chai.js tests. But of course, if you are importing some Node.js library to be able to execute your Chai tests, that library may not be supported. I know at least of one company that is doing functional testing and running them through K6, and they have implemented, they have two runners. One runner is external to K6 and one is K6. So they share code between code bases.
One thing that I didn't explore, because for in the demo a while ago, the most common like script.js, so all of those actually were copied, from the Chai.js website. But I think like with Chai, you can also use plugins. Is that something that we can also import directly to K6, or does it need extra like configuration?
Yes, it's possible to use plugins with this library in K6. And one plugin that I have recently integrated was for contract validation. So there is an extension to Chai.js for contract validation, and that's a plugin. I haven't documented it yet. I cannot find time, but maybe I should talk to Marie and we can document it.
Yeah, and Paul as well.
Yeah. Another question. Will you have any check for UI, visual testing, and in browser level testing?
Yeah, totally. We have it. I even have an example here.
Ooh, okay, cool.
I don't know if I can share my screen, but let's see. Share screen.
But yeah, browser level testing was what Marie was doing when she discovered it.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see if I can zoom in.
That's great.
I have a browser test here, and there is some setup for the browser, launching Chromium, opening new page, going to a URL, waiting for the network to finish, then fetching an element from the DOM. So I'm fetching a logo element, and then I'm making a describe and expect for this DOM element. So I'm doing logo element is visible. So checking if this logo is actually on the page. And I'm using Chai for this. And as you see, this is definitely BDD to be true, which is, I think, very nice. And then another one, I'm checking the width of this logo. So I expect it to be within 100 and 200 pixels. So that's totally a browser test. And and we are launching actual Chrome here. I don't know if I can run this, but let me see. Let's see if I can open a terminal here. I'm not used to the, let's see, view terminal. There we go. Oh no, this is the wrong version of K6.
Yeah.
XK6.
Cloud Beta 8. Let's run with this version. Okay, that was very quick. So maybe I should have slept for a moment. Here, let's do sleep 5 to sleep for 5 seconds, so we see a little better this browser window. There we go. Okay, that was unexpected. All right, this example, I coded it just a second before the stream, so it's not very good. But you can see from the code that this is launching a Chrome and has those two expects for DOM elements in the actual browser. So you can do UI level testing here.
I think just
Okay.
I think there's like a comment that whether it's for a UI visual testing, and I don't think we're currently supporting visual testing, but we can do browser level testing like with functional via XK6 browser, but it's not from a visual perspective.
Right. Yeah. If we mean like comparing screenshots, then this is not yet ready.
Yeah.
That's so painful anyway. A question again before we close. Will it handle browser redirections and WebSockets protocol?
Sure, it does. K6 natively does that, and K6 browser also does that.
So anything that you can write a check for in K6, you can use chai.js with, right?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, great. Well, we're out of time, but it was great to have you both. I feel like I've learned a lot in this session, which is always a great thing. So thank you both for joining me, and thank you to everybody who is watching along and asking us your questions. Pawel, just to close us off, where should people go to if they want to find out more about chai.js or maybe suggest new features or contribute to it?
Right, so this is an open source library, and the integration is also open source. We have it on GitHub. Go to GitHub. I think we shared the link here. Create issues, and we are welcoming pull requests as well if you want to contribute. The documentation for chai.js is on our official docs, so k6io/docs, and check out the blog that Ben has written a few days ago.
Okay, yep, this one, but it's also in the comments. So, okay, thank you for joining me, and thank you to everybody who is here. We'll see you all next week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.